A study group was convened in Rome this week to look at the Amazon Synod. But why were the attendees kept secret? The National Catholic Register's Edward Penton reports from Rome. And the UK nearly forced one of its citizens to have an abortion. But where were the English bishops? Editor-in-chief of the Catholic Herald, Damian Thompson, is here with analysis. And Communist China's human rights record continues to worsen, particularly for girls and women. China watcher and president of the Women's Rights Without Frontiers, Reggie Littlejohn, will give us more details. The World Over begins right now.
Now, from Washington, D.C., Raymond Arroyo.
A warm welcome to all of you joining us in the United States and the world over. A great show for you tonight. Edward Penton, Damian Thompson, Reggie Littlejohn, and many more straight ahead. If you'd like to comment on tonight's show, send me a tweet. I'm at Raymond Arroyo, or you can email us at worldover@ewtn.com. Lots to cover this evening, but first, some breaking news. After a years-long legal battle, the remains of Archbishop Fulton Sheen have been transferred from New York to Peoria, Illinois. Sheen's niece, Joan Sheen Cunningham, and Diocese of Peoria attorney Patricia Gibson gathered at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York to disinter the remains of Sheen. They were then flown to O'Hare, where they were transported to the Peoria Diocese. Now, the Diocese of Peoria said the beatification process for Sheen has resumed. Sheen was an El Paso, Illinois native, ordained as a priest in Peoria in 1919. He later moved to New York, where he became an early televangelist on radio and later television. Bishop Daniel Janke said he's hopeful Sheen will be beatified this year. And a private meeting involving mostly German-speaking prelates and experts was held in Rome this week to discuss the upcoming Amazonian Synod. Now, according to the Holy See spokesman, Alessandro Gisotti, the gathering was a study meeting of the Pan-Amazonian Ecclesial Network, but he said he was unable to give details about the participants. The Synod's working document released last week has been heavily criticized for what some say is excessive emphasis on ecological conversion and controversially proposing a married priesthood. Joining us now, Edward Penton of the National Catholic Register. He discovered exactly who was at that secret meeting and why it matters. Edward Penton joins us from Rome. Ed, thanks for being here. Who exactly was at this meeting, and why are some in Rome so concerned, Ed?
Well, it was made up, Raymond, of primarily European experts, bishops, to discuss the upcoming synod and preparation for it. I understood later that one of the key issues to be discussed was the ordination of married men to cater for the shortage of priests in parts of the Amazon. That was a key area that they were trying to prepare for the synod. But it was the interesting point about this was that was its sort of secretive nature. It wasn't discussed. It wasn't advertised in any way, and also the high level of particularly German-speaking bishops involved in this.
And you had, and we'll run through them. You can explain who these people are for those who might not know. You had really headlining this Cardinal Mueller, who is the general relator of the Synod. Why is his presence important?
Yes, well, Cardinal Claudio has for a long time pushed this idea of ordination of married men, not just, I think he supports it not just in the Amazon, I think he'd like this for the universal church. At least that's the signals he's given over the years. And he's actually the general relator of the Synod, so he's basically the man in charge of it. But there are also other members who people found very concerning. That's Bishop Erwin Kreutler, who's an Austrian bishop who spent many years in Brazil. He's also in favor of this ordination of married men, but also women priests. And there are others too who drew concern, particularly the German bishop who is in charge of a lot of money that the German bishops give to Latin America. And so there's some concern that there's sort of a money going towards this synod from Germany and with it sort of German agenda for the church.
Now, you also had Cardinal Valdiserri, who is the General Secretary of the Synod of Bishops, as well as Cardinal Casper, Walter Casper there, who was such a driving force in that family synod. Your reaction to their presence, and what do you think is the through line here?
Right, well, Cardinal Valdiserri is kind of expected. He's the Secretary General of the Synod of Bishops, so he needs to be there to really guide, I suppose, what's going to go into the Synod. What's interesting about that as a sideline is that I actually called the Synod of Bishops to ask if the person there knew about this meeting, or there was a meeting like this in Rome, and he denied all knowledge of it. And the other person you mentioned, well, there's Cardinal Schönborn was also invited, although he was too ill to come.
Right.
But there are others too who I think were of concern, and it very much there's nobody really there of a particularly orthodox view of the church, and I think that's what drew a lot of concern.
Ed, is there any orthodox organized group challenging the ideas of this working document?
Well, one of the groups that has set up to try and offer some critique of this is the Tradition, Family and Property movement, which has obviously came from Brazil. Its founder was from Brazil. Many of its members come from Latin America, and they've studied this for a long time. They're particularly experts in liberation theology and the dangers of liberation theology, and they've been very vocal about this. They've even set up a website called Pan-Amazonian Synod Watch, and they're really wanting to show the problems that they see are in this synod. But we've heard other critics too come out, including today Cardinal Walter Brandmüller.
I'm going to get to that.
A very strong critique.
Yes, we're going to get to that in a moment, Ed. I don't want you taking all the winds out of our sails here. Bishop Franz Joseph Overbeck, who is the of Essen, Germany. He's the head of the German Bishops' Latin American Commission. And as you point out in your piece, Bishop Overbeck said the synod will lead the church, quote, to a point of no return, and thereafter nothing will be the same as it was. What exactly does that mean?
Well, it's not clear, but the suspicion is that the German bishops are really wanting to use this synod to push through their agenda, which is to basically change the church's teaching on morality, particularly sexual morality. And there's a sense that is the goal of the German bishops, and the fact that he said that shows that perhaps that's true, that there is a scheme, if you like, to use this synod to get through these agendas through the back door, and their kind of ideology for the church, which as others say, and many senior clergy have said to me that they think is wrong, and it's purely projecting their own vision on the church.
Well, according to Cardinal Valdiserri, who is the Synod Secretary, he says this is going to be a time of, quote, pastoral reflection open to recognizing diversity and listening to the Amazonian reality with all its cultural and ecclesial facets. Why have a synod when the outcome seems already determined, Ed? This feels like the family synod routine all over again.
Well, that's it, Raymond. I mean, that's another concern, that this has already been predetermined. What's quite interesting is that one of the key bodies connected with this synod was actually started long before the synod was announced, back in 2014. It's called REPAM. It was set up by Caritas, and it's headed by Cardinal Mueller. And it seems as though there's been this agenda for quite some time to try and to use this synod to get through a lot of things which were put at bay during the pontificates of John Paul II and Benedict XVI. And I think that seems fairly clear. Now, it should be said that I think there are elements here which people support, and that I think any Catholic would support. That people do think there are things we can learn, of course, from the indigenous people. But I think there's a lot of concern that they're being used essentially and exploited to get to further these ideas and this agenda.
Yeah.
And I think that's causing a lot of concern. And there's not much that's been said to kind of allay those fears, I think.
Yeah, it's kind of a Trojan horse. Cardinal Walter Brandmüller, who you mentioned a moment ago, he told LifeSite News, "It is impossible to conceal that this synod intends especially to help implement two most cherished projects that heretofore have never been implemented, namely the abolishment of celibacy and the introduction of a female priesthood, starting with female deacons. He continues, the Instrumentum Laboris, the working document, contradicts the binding teaching of the Church in decisive points and thus has to be qualified as heretical. Inasmuch as the divine revelation is being questioned or misunderstood, one also has to speak additionally of apostasy. Ed Penton, apostasy, heretical. What's your reaction to this? And is Brandmueller being ignored or taken seriously in his critique?
Well, it's hard to say. It only came out this morning, and I haven't really heard about much reaction. But I think people will take this seriously, especially those who obviously already have some concerns. But I think he's said same things also that the traditional family and property said, which is that, again, he says that they're using the gospel basically to push through this agenda, and that it's not. It doesn't really have much to do with the gospel. It has the emphasis is primarily, they think, on the indigenous people and really listening. It talks a lot about listening to the indigenous people, but not a lot about evangelization and conversion to the faith. And I think that's his main concern. I mean, he's very strong. He talks about a perversion of enculturation in this document, and he says it needs to be rejected decisively. So he's very, very strong and very critical of it, and really thinks that it's just promoting a sort of natural religion and pantheism. And he sees there's really very little there which is authentically Catholic.
Yeah, Brandmueller also says, we're listening to a population of, roughly half the size of Mexico City. And my feeling is, look, if we need to, if we want to learn about living off the land and communing with nature and, living in off the grid, surely these are people to be listened to. But if we're talking about theology or even civilization, advanced civilization, these people are living, cut off from the rest of the world. So I'm not sure exactly what lessons they have to give the church at large, much less Rome. But I guess this remains to be seen. We'll be watching in October, Edward. I want to move on one before I let you go. Pope Francis is planning to receive the Order of Malta's Grand Master in a private audience on Friday. This is their first meeting since Fra Giacomo, he's the Grand Master, banned public liturgies in the extraordinary form for the order, the Latin Mass, essentially. First, what was the reaction in Rome to that decision, and how do you think people, do they believe that Pope Francis might have had a hand in this decision?
Well, again, it's always who you talk to, Raymond, in Rome, what their reaction is. Certainly among those who favour tradition more, they were really shocked and very angered by this, and they thought it was completely unnecessary. But they thought it actually obviously increases divisions rather than heals them, because now you've got a very disenfranchised and disenchanted part of the church in the Knights of Malta. But whether it came from Pope Francis, people don't know. It seems kind of unlikely that it did come from the Holy Father, because he's actually quite I wouldn't say ambivalent about the Old Mass, but he doesn't take a whole lot of interest in the liturgy. And I think it's most probably, at least what I hear, that it's come from the higher-ups in the Knights of Malta, and particularly the Grand Chancellor, Albrecht von Boeselager, who's long been pushing for a sort of more secular image of the order, if you like, moving away from more religious aspects. So I think it primarily comes from him and from those around him, rather than perhaps the Pope himself.
Edward Penton, as always, thank you for your reporting. And you can find Edward's fine reporting in the National Catholic Register at ncregister.com or on Twitter at Edward Penton. Thank you, Ed. We'll check in with you soon. Joining us now to discuss other important Catholic stories this week is the editor-in-chief of the Catholic Herald in the UK, a 25-year veteran reporter on church affairs. Please welcome Damian Thompson back to the program from London. Damian, thanks for being with us. The big story in Britain this week, really all over the world, was the near-forced abortion of this baby at just 22 weeks. A UK justice who is a known activist ruled last week that the mother, a woman with mental difficulties and disabilities, wasn't fit to parent the child. The justice said that an abortion was in the woman's best interest, and it appeared that the ruling would be carried out until Monday of this week. Tell us about the case and this justice, Natalie Leven.
The case was one of the most horrible things ever to happen in a British courtroom, one of the most horrible judgments ever handed down by a British court, and thank God it was stopped. But this activist judge, as you rightly describe her, Natalie Leven, ordered a 22-year-old mentally disabled woman to abort her child, or to allow, it wasn't a question of allowing, but basically the judicial execution of this child was announced. And the Catholic world, the humanitarian world, was unbelievably horrified by this. The woman was given no choice in it, but insofar as she understood it, she didn't want it to happen.
Right.
And her mother, the baby's grandmother, who's a Catholic Nigerian midwife, didn't want it to happen and said she would arrange for the baby to be looked after. But nonetheless, the decision was handed down very firmly. It was almost as if Mrs. Justice Leven was wearing a black cap in the way that British judges used to put on a little black cap when they announced the death sentence. And this happened on Friday. And from Friday until Monday, there was growing anger, which I picked up very clearly from the Catholic Herald's US readership, especially from the US. This horrible ruling with totalitarian overtones. And all weekend, I waited for the Catholic bishops of England and Wales to say something, because the judicial system is different in England and Wales, they're separate. And so I was waiting for them to say something, and nothing was said.
Yeah.
I sat there reading the Twitter feed of the Catholic Church in England and Wales, and all weekend there were just sort of PC witterings on this and that subject. So the Catholic Herald stood up to the plate and asked the bishops to speak, emphasizing, you know, how horrified Catholics were around the world. And on Monday morning, we got a statement from a junior bishop called John Sherrington, an auxiliary in Westminster. Has a pretty good reputation as an Orthodox Catholic, but it began by noting that every abortion is a tragedy for the family involved. Now, as soon as you hear a sort of truism, a throat-clearing truism, I described it like that, you know that nothing memorable or significant will follow. And sure enough, you know, he came out against the abortion.
Yeah, well, let me read. I'll read you. Let me share with the audience.
Human rights of the mother and the child.
Damien, I want to share the audience the rest of John Sherrington's, Bishop John Sherrington's statement. He says, in our society, there's a delicate balance between the rights of the individual and powers of the state. This was a sad and distressing situation for the whole family. What impression, if any, did this message make?
It was summed up beautifully by the great writer, Tim Stanley, a columnist for the Catholic Herald, who tweeted out, "We note with regret that Jesus Christ has been nailed to a cross. Our thoughts and prayers are with his family at this time." That's the impression it made. There was not a note of the righteous anger that, you know, I was with my sister, and a wonderful neighbour who's not Catholic, and you know, probably doesn't buy all the church's teaching on abortion. But when I explained what was happening to her, she was in tears. And when the ruling came through on Monday that it had been cancelled, I got a text message from this lovely woman saying, "Thank God, a life has been saved." So if non-Catholics who aren't completely pro-life were that horrified, where was the horror from the English bishops? And actually, where were the celebrations when this murder, this execution, was cancelled, was overruled by the Court of Appeal?
I want to share with you something
look,
that
I've spent 30 years
I want to read,
watching these bishops do nothing.
I want to read something from Lord David Alton of Liverpool, a guest on this program. This was from his column this week in the Herald, and I want to contrast it with the Church's response. He said, "The truly chilling decision to end the life of a child against the wishes of its mother and grandmother and against the advice of a social worker would have been a coercive abortion worthy of the People's Republic of China." Now, Damien, your thoughts on Lord Alton's words, and why couldn't the bishops of the UK muster something at least as strong?
Well, that's precisely the question I asked in a column I wrote next to Lord Alton's. He's a very old friend of mine, and he is the single politician in the United Kingdom whom I admire most. And I said if a bishop had made that perfectly reasonable point about this being worthy of the People's Republic of China, people would have talked about it. But it would have rocked the boat. And something happens to even the most orthodox bishop, one or two exceptions maybe, but even an orthodox bishop like John Sherrington, as soon as they get the mitre, it's like they're taken in a little room and told the bishop's 13th commandment, which is, thou shalt not rock the boat. And we're not talking about the bark of Peter, it's like something Henley or whatever, just don't rock the boat. And they never do. But this time they've miscalculated, because I believe, and my colleagues at the Catholic Herald believe, that we are approaching what I call the pro-life moment. We have seen atrocities in New York State. We've seen this thwarted atrocity. And we've seen people who counted themselves as pro-choice beginning to think again. And the fact that our bishops, and let me include your bishops as well, Cardinal Supich, feeble things he's been saying recently, are not leading public opinion on this is a betrayal of their orders and a betrayal of their identity as Christians and their identity as shepherds.
I want to, before this case was overruled, or the ruling was overruled, the justice had determined the mother would suffer greater trauma by having her baby adopted than by having an abortion. What exactly was that based on? I mean, what was the criteria for determining that, Damian?
I don't know. The whole thing is so twisted that you almost wonder if the forces of darkness are involved. And I don't normally say that sort of thing. But it was as if this judge wanted the abortion to happen. And who was it? It was Archbishop Chaput who said recently that the Democratic Party, but this would also hold for left-wing opinion in Britain, has almost turned abortion into a perverse sort of sacrament, something that was holy in itself.
Damian, we've had the Charlie Gard case and others in Europe where the government intervenes in family and very personal decisions, saying it knows best. This was a very close call. What was the role of the NHS, the National Health System here, and was the appeals court overruling a strong statement for protecting life? Or do you expect to see more of rulings like this?
I don't know too many of the details, and lots of the details have been withheld from us. I don't know to what extent this is a debate about the NHS. I genuinely don't think this is a debate about socialised medicine, as you call it, which is a very complex subject. We have
and I know beloved in England. I was just there, and people love the NHS.
Private and socialised medicine here, but people love the NHS. I like bits of the NHS, I must say. I don't like other bits of it. I'm certainly against worshipping the NHS. It seems to be. Nigel Lawson once said it was the only closest thing to a real religion that the English people actually have, which is the NHS. But you know, I'm not going to condemn everybody in the NHS, because there are, for example, doctors and nurses in the NHS who are changing their minds about abortion because they can see the advances that are happening in science, the increasing viability of the fetus, as they always call it, to the point where they're going to have to stop talking about it as a fetus. Funny how it's always a baby when it's, you know, maternity stuff and baby showers and things like that before it's born, but it's a fetus if you want to kill it. I've watched people get radicalized. I've watched American friends of mine get radicalized. I've seen the March for Life grow enormously. I've always grotesquely unreported, of course. But the pro-life moment is approaching. And it's up to us, you and me, Raymond, to actually play a part in that.
I touched on this with Ed Penton earlier, and I need to touch on this with you. Some very high-ranking criticism of that working document for the Amazon Synod that we're seeing. This is going to take place in Rome in October. One of the dubia cardinals, Cardinal Walter Brandmueller, issued a stinging critique where he called the document heretical and imparts apostasy. Your thoughts on this? Now, some will say, you know, this is Brandmueller himself has said it should be rejected with all decisiveness. Now, I know you've got some thoughts on this Amazon Synod in general. What do you make of Brandmueller's assessment?
It's an incredibly powerful and well-written document. I'm in two minds on the subject of bringing heresy and apostasy as concepts into it. Not because I disagree with him, but because I think the debate will become so focused on the precise meaning of those words. So there'll be long debates about, no, it is heresy, no, it isn't heresy, and it'll become a debate between theologians. Actually, Cardinal Mueller made so many brilliant points in that document. For example, he called it an aggressive intrusion into the purely worldly affairs of the state and society of Brazil. And he asked what professional expertise authorizes an ecclesial synod of bishops to make statements in these fields. But the point I really liked in Cardinal Mueller's document was his criticism of the way that the forests of the Amazon region are being viewed by a Vatican working document as a special source of divine revelation, which was my reaction when I read this garbage. It reads like a sort of pithy Disney production, Avatar, written by octogenarian European socialists. Tell us, O wise ones, what the spirits of the forest are telling us. And as for its patronizing liberal sanctification of indigenous religion, let's take a look at the main author of this document, who's Bishop Irving Kreutler. Now, the redoubtable Micah Hickson has been doing some burrowing. She's revealed that he's come out against criminalizing the infanticide, which is sometimes carried out by some indigenous peoples there, and I certainly don't wish to libel them all and to say that it's a very widespread practice, but it is a problem there. And this nearly 80-year-old Austrian bishop, very anti-colonialist, of course, but he's an Austrian bishop in charge of this project, in charge of drawing up the document,
right,
has come out against criminalizing the infanticide, sometimes practiced by some of these people, because here, in the name of human rights and under the pretext of suppressing infanticide, a broad ethnocide, a cultural murder is being installed. If that means anything, it means something very sinister.
Yeah, no, that's troubling.
There's another point. A very, very good article written by the formidable Father Roger Landry. Now, I was recently in Rome, had the great privilege of attending a pilgrimage led by him. And he made a point about the plan to ordain elders because there's a shortage of priests in the Amazon. And he said, most of those in the Amazon don't have access to adequate quality formal education. We're not talking about the ordination of married men with doctorates, masters, or even bachelor's degrees in theology or anything else. We would be studying whether to ordain even those with only an elementary level education, such as they might struggle even to read the scriptures and the missal. And then Father Landry goes on to make the point that the very, very uneducated clergy of the Middle Ages led us into all sorts of problems which helped cause the Reformation. The whole thing worries me enormously. Look, I've been down the Amazon. I've visited a strange religious group. I've visited a particularly very strange religious group in the Amazon, not necessarily representative, but I do know that religion in all parts of the developing world is syncretic,
right,
and therefore not fully Catholic. And to be using this bit of the world as a laboratory for religious experimentation is beggars belief. And my personal message about the Amazon Synod is cancel it now.
I want to move on to another story out of Rome this week. As the McCarrick investigation drags on with no results, Argentinian Bishop Gustavo Ancheta, who's facing a criminal sexual misconduct trial in his home country, has been granted permission by an Argentine judge to leave the country and return to Rome. Now, why has this man, with his checkered past, to say the least, I'm putting it lightly for my audience, why has he been given another accommodation, and why would the Vatican permit him to come into their midst?
There are so many similar questions one could ask about a range of unsavory characters who seem to find sanctuary in the Vatican. And the case of Bishop Ancheta, of course, is the most notorious of all of them. I find this deeply troubling. Recently, I talked to a cardinal, one who's it would have been regarded as pro rather than anti-Francis, and I went through all these cases, some of which he didn't even know about. And I said, these are cases in which really serious questions about decisions made by the Holy Father need to be answered, and he's refusing to answer them. It's your job as a cardinal to ask those questions. Now, he hasn't, he won't. But what I did notice is he didn't put up a single word of defense of the current advisors to the Holy Father, if we'll put it diplomatically.
Well, what is the message, though, Damian, here? What's the message this is sending to the faithful?
The message this is sending to the faithful is, this is none of your business. Even though it is the children of the faithful or the faithful themselves who have had to suffer from these scandals, either directly as the victims of abuse, or they've seen parish life disintegrate, their family life disintegrate. The message is, well, it's the same message that was sent when the horrible, now dead, Cardinal Daniels tried to cover up incestuous child abuse and then was invited to a synod on the family. It's hard to sum up the message in polite words, so I won't try.
Yeah, I don't blame you. It was announced recently the Church in Scotland has authorized an independent audit of all its dioceses to ensure that sex abuse cases are being properly handled. Your thought on this, independent being the word, of course, why are the bishops in the UK having an easier time agreeing to this than their counterparts in other parts of the world?
Those were the bishops in Scotland, and the situation is rather confusing, but basically the Church in Scotland is quite separate from the Church in England and Wales. And the Church in Scotland, it tends to be very left-wing in some areas. It is unhealthily close, I think, to the nationalist government. But in many ways, it's quite strong and fearless. And I heartily applaud its decision to submit itself to this scrutiny, if you like, to have the humility to say, we can't be trusted in these matters. And it is clearly what needs to happen in some shape or form in America. And I really don't think you can improve on the broad formula set up by Father Gerald Murray on your program, which is for independent tribunals to be given the authority to look at every document in every chancery all over the world.
And then,
this is what we need.
I've been on my high horse for years.
You would agree with me.
Well, Damian, for years I've been on my high horse.
Thank God you have.
They should also have an independent financial audit of every diocese that should be run by the laity. That should happen yesterday.
Absolutely. And here's the Catholic Herald. It says, cleaning up. Catholics must demand urgent financial reforms. And here's a picture of one of the wonderful cartoons of two bishops with in a restaurant with the cast might be familiar to anybody who watched The Sopranos. It's precisely what we're saying.
Well, I agree with you.
And we'll work with you on this.
We should talk more.
Promise. Also
in Scotland, the church there announced it would not be changing the words of the Lord's Prayer, despite the clear wishes of the Pope. Your thoughts? Is this a minor issue of semantics, or does it potentially change the words of Christ in a significant way?
Who knows? I do know that it's entirely unnecessary. Who knows whether it changes the words of Christ? But those who are experts in New Testament Greek, but of course he didn't say it in New Testament Greek, say that it does change the words of the New Testament Greek. And clearly, even I can see that it changes the words of the Latin. Why? Why is it necessary? Looks to me like change for the sake of change, or possibly change to distract people from the really important and worrying stuff that's going on in the church. I don't see the need for it, and I don't see the academic arguments for it. If you wanted to change anything, it would probably focus on the word temptation rather than lead us into, because there are apocalyptic resonances, a time of trial, that Christians will be led into a time of trial at the end of time. But that's not what this addresses. This is just a sort of tidying up. And somebody's dreamt it up, Spadaro or somebody like that has dreamt it up. It's a manageable story for the Vatican. The really unmanageable stories, the ones involving Ancheta, the ones involving all sorts of things happening quite close to the Holy Father, these are not being pursued, and the Vatican doesn't want them pursued.
I also need to ask you...
The Catholic Herald is about to make a big appointment in Rome.
Yeah, I also want to ask you about this religious freedom story in Australia. A professional rugby player, he's really going through the blades for his history of speaking out against gay marriage. Now, he's been dismissed from the league for now. Now, he does so on religious grounds. And you have an Australian Christian group that's gone to bat for him. They've raised over $1 million for his legal fees. He's suing the Rugby Association. What's happening to religious freedom in Australia?
Well, there's a very selective attack on free speech in Australia and in other countries. Something about Australia and perhaps Canada as well. And free speech is being curtailed. But it's the free speech of Christians that is specifically being curtailed. We know that many religions hold very, very conservative views on sexual matters. And it's not a problem for anybody if they express them. It's only a problem if Christians express them. I did a podcast for The Spectator about this just a few days ago, asking why is it that it's the expression of Christian views, whether you agree with them or not, that is being curtailed, that is being really suppressed in this case. And the justification given by the rugby authorities was so pathetic. They basically they want to shut him up. It's not about professional standards. It's not about the game. They just don't want to hear these views expressed, so they want to shut him up.
Last week, we reported that the head of the Knights of Malta, and we talked about this with Ed Penton, that he banned the celebration of the traditional Latin Mass, the extraordinary form, in all the official ceremonies of Malta. Give me your sense. The Pope is meeting with the Grand Master this week. Why the hostility to the old Mass, particularly in an order as old and historic as the Knights of Malta?
It makes no sense at all, except as, if you like, a sort of victory lap by Boselager, the German who's taken over the Knights of Malta. I mean, the Grand Master is just a figurehead, really, for Boselager. It's a convoluted business. I think Ed Penton revealed that some Scandinavian woman had a particular hatred of the old liturgy, and this was her request. We carried a very strong cover story about this. And about the way that religious orders, if you count them as a religious order, are particularly, it's very easy to control. It's very easy to make sure that Summorum Pontificum is not observed in religious orders. It's much harder for that to happen in parishes. And today comes the news that the Grand Prior of the English Order of Malta, Ian Scott, who appallingly, I thought, defended the ban on the traditional Mass in a letter to the Catholic Herald, has been sacked. In fact, there seems to have been it's just breaking today. I was just reading on my phone on my way to the studio. There seems to be another wave of sackings and purges, and I wonder whether the Order of Malta really exists anymore, to be honest.
That's my sense. Well,
but as for its suppression of the traditional Mass, it's an absolute disgrace.
Well, the members of Malta should raise up and let their voices be heard. I mean, it's their dues that perpetuate this order. It's their philanthropy.
Well, I hope the American ones will. I hope the American ones will, because a lot of them are very attached to the traditional Mass. And the idea that the traditional Mass is divisive is something that I think it probably was the case 20, 30 years ago. But what really worries the aristocratic liberals, and my goodness, Boselager and his chums are incredibly aristocratic. What really seems to worry them is that the old Mass has ceased to be divisive. That's what they don't like. The young Catholics are going to it, if you like, to escape the liturgy wars in other parts of the Church.
Right. Well, they look, if you talk to young Catholics and spend time with them, they're going to the Latin Mass because they don't like the hand-holding and the guitar, introductions at these other Masses. And they realize, oh, this is what it's supposed to be. That's what they tell me, at least. Now, I go to both rites. I've seen it all.
I mean, I never cease banging on. I mean, look, even my generation hated that. What's the phrase I always use for it? Joan Baez meets Hildegard of Bingen in a 1970s cocktail lounge. It's a horrific sound. You never hear it otherwise. This music that's written by not the St. Louis Jesuits anymore. They've all left apparently. But it's written by these rather well-off, heavily copyrighted professional composers in league with their local bishops and whatever. There's a lot of money involved. But you hear that horrible music. You never hear it in the outside world. It's a sort of excruciating little genre. And
it's its own genre. It's a time warp. It's like a nostalgia track.
They don't approve of.
Anyway, Damian, when we last spoke,
it's a nostalgia track that actually makes even genuine old hippies who heard proper, folk music and rock music. Actually, it makes even them cringe.
They repel as well. No, they're not there. They're not in the pews either. Damian, when last we spoke, your dear sister Carmel was suffering some ill health. How is she doing?
She was. She'd been diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer, which is a very serious diagnosis. And I am absolutely delighted to say that she is in remission.
Wow.
She is bursting with health and energy. We spent a wonderful day on Sunday with Rosa Moncton, who's founded the charity Team Domenica named and working with her daughter Domenica, who has Down syndrome. And something that gives me real pleasure is that Carmel, who was qualified as a medical doctor, has had a very successful career in medical advertising, but has also been Catholic, has also been a pro-life counsellor. Carmel's going to be joining us and supporting us in a major pro-life project that the Catholic Herald is going to be launching. Our provisional name is the Mission for Life, and it's one that seeks to join together the fight for life, the fight for unborn life, and the fight for persecuted Christians. In other words, babies murdered in the womb and Christians murdered outside of it. And we're very lucky in that our new consulting editor, Father Benedict Keeley, who I'm sure you know, a great hero of mine, is going to be, well, not just advising, but directing us on this. Because, we're called the Catholic Herald, and obviously we refer to ourselves as the Herald, but there's 2 names in our title, and the first name is 1,000,000 times more important than the second.
Well, Dr. Damian Thompson, thank you so much for being with us. Our best to Carmel and everybody there. For more reportage that Damian spoke of, you can go to CatholicHeraldUS.com, or on Twitter, he's at Holy Smoke. Thank you, Damian. We'll check in with you soon. On June 25th, Women's Rights Without Frontiers co-hosted a panel at the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva, Switzerland. The panel was entitled Abandoned in China, Baby Girls and Abandoned Widows. According to the report, the 2 most vulnerable groups of females in China are baby girls whose mothers are pressured to abort or abandon them, and elderly widows. Now, widows are exponentially increasing all over the world, but the rising number of poor, destitute widows has been quite invisible, especially in China. In a society that continues to favor males, baby girls and elderly widows are often considered a liability. My next guest addressed the UN panel in Geneva this week. Joining us from Houston to talk about her testimony is the president of the Women's Rights Without Frontiers, Reggie Littlejohn. Reggie, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Raymond.
Now, according to one UN estimate, there are more than 200 million women and girls missing in the world because of sex-selective abortions and abandonment. Now, that number, 200 million, is greater than all the casualties of all the wars of the 20th century combined. I want to start with the widows in China. You've blamed China's one-child policy for the abandonment of widows in China. How is that connected?
Well, this is one of the many horrible unintended consequences of the one-child policy, which is that historically, traditionally, elders have been venerated in China, and couples in the countryside would have a very large family, and then when they got old, they would have this large family to support them. And that's what they had instead of Social Security. Now, because of the one-child policy, the family structure in China has been completely decimated, and these widows are finding themselves completely alone and abandoned and destitute. And for example, one of the widows that we are supporting, didn't have enough money to eat every day, so some days she only ate salt, and she bought herself a rope to hang herself with when life just got too tough. And senior suicide has been skyrocketing in China because of the abandon not only of the widows but of all elderly.
According to statistics of the U.S. State Department, about 590 women a day kill themselves in China. And senior suicide rates, as you mentioned, they've risen 500% in the last 20 years. Seniors killing themselves has become normalized. It's considered an honorable way to go, correct?
That's right, and it's really, really heartbreaking, Raymond. There's in one of the widows that we're supporting, when her husband got sick, their daughter-in-law came to them and actually yelled at them, saying, "What, basically, she went around to the neighbors saying, why don't they just die? Why doesn't he just die?" And she pointed out another widow or another woman in the area. When she found out that she had breast cancer, she went and hanged herself on the tree in the backyard so that her family would not have to pay the medical expenses. And she was holding this up as an example for the widow that we're supporting and her husband of what they should do so that their family would not become homeless. That's the word that she used.
Wow. Is there any awareness among the Chinese regime where this two-child policy has led and the consequences to their society?
Yes, I think that there is a lot of awareness there, and that's why they moved from a one-child policy to a two-child policy. They didn't do it as a form of reparation or because they're sorry for all the forced abortions, like hundreds of millions of forced abortions that they have committed. That wasn't the reason. It was not having to do with human rights. It's having to do with the senior tsunami that is about to hit China because they don't have enough young people to support their rapidly aging population.
Now, you've been campaigning to save girls for years. Why is it relatively difficult to muster the same support for saving widows?
This is very interesting because the same network that has been saving girls for years in China, I noticed these elderly widows and I wanted to help them. And when you say save the baby girls, there's this big, everybody wants to do that. And when you say save the widows, there's like a very small response. And I think that it's because people want to save babies because these are the future. And when you're dealing with widows, you're dealing with somebody who, if you save her, in other words, if you give her support so that she can eat every day, she's never going to become an economically productive member of society. Her years as a wife and a mother are over. So to me, this is the test of how much we actually care about the dignity of the person. If we're willing to support someone as they go from this life into the next, even though they're not going to become a productive member of society, but at least they will die knowing that somebody cares about them and not die of starvation or suicide.
When we look at China and India, Reggie, men outnumber women by 70 million. In China, they outnumber women 30 to 40 million. This imbalance is the driving force behind human trafficking and sexual slavery, not only in China, elsewhere as well. What's being done to combat this problem, this scourge?
Oh, well, not hardly anything, according to the recent TIP report that came out just last week. Trafficking in Persons report rated China as a Tier 3 nation for the third time in a row. And what that means is that they are a major destination and origin of trafficking, and they are not, the government is not doing enough to stop it. And there is evidence both in China and in India of actual complicity of the government with traffickers. So, you think that there's 30 or 40 million more men than women living in China today, and I think that the government probably thinks, oh my gosh, if we stop the trafficking, we'd have an insurrection on our hands, and so they just look the other way.
It's unbelievable. And I guess that's how they're dealing with the fact that you've got 24 million Chinese men of marrying age that don't have spouses. They can't find spouses. So I suppose trafficking's their answer.
Yeah, and there's very terrible situations where women are lured to come to China saying, oh, we're going to get you a great job, you'll be able to send money home to your family or whatever, and then they get to China, and the men who marry them have to pay these enormous fees to the traffickers, and then what they do is they actually rent the women out, their wives out as prostitutes to recoup that fee. So they're not just in a forced marriage, but they're also forced into prostitution at the same time.
It's barbaric. It's really unbelievable. I want to move on to the topic of religious freedom. This is intertwined. Last week, the State Department issued its annual report on international religious freedom. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said this of China:
The Chinese Communist Party has exhibited extreme hostility to all religious faiths since its founding. The party demands that it alone be called God. That's why, in an effort to document the staggering scope of religious freedom abuses in Xinjiang, we've added a special section to this year's China report.
The religious persecution in China, it's so bad that there, as you heard Pompeo say, there's a separate section for it in the report. Now, the Vatican signed a deal with the Chinese government in September, Reggie. Since then, churches and Marian shrines have been decimated. The persecution of Christians has even gotten worse. What's driving this? What is driving this hatred of religion?
Okay, if you're asking me what's driving the Vatican to sign that deal, I mean, I don't have any better answer than anyone else. You know, what Pope Francis says is he's trying to unify the two churches of the underground church and the above ground church. But what's happened, in fact, is that because that deal is secret, the Chinese Communist Party has been using it to bludgeon the church, decimating churches, decimating Marian shrines, detaining priests. And I think that deal, the text of that deal should be made public so that people will be able to defend themselves. Because what the Chinese Communist Party does is they go in and say, your own Pope told us that we should be able to do this. And I have no doubt that Pope Francis and that deal does not authorize the things that are going on, but the fact that it's secret leaves the people in China helpless.
Yeah, well, and in a moment when you're seeing these uprisings in Hong Kong, it would seem the perfect time for the church to stand strong and stand with the underground community that's been persecuted and tortured for decades now. Now, Auxiliary Bishop Ignatius C. Wang of San Francisco, who was born in Beijing, said in an interview this week that given the circumstances of the Catholic Church in China, the deal with the Vatican is very good. He went on to say regarding the appointment of bishops, quote, the agreement acknowledges you have the last word, but we recommend. There are nearly 6,000 bishops in the world. How many would the Pope know personally? It has to be local as long as it is done conscientiously. I just hope it doesn't happen that they send bad ones on purpose for approval in Rome. He went on to say regarding the persecution compared to the history of the church, this time is not worse than any other time. Your take, your response to that.
Well, I think that the second to last sentence of that is the most important one, where he says, I hope that they won't send bad ones to Rome on purpose. Of course they're going to send bad ones to Rome on purpose. I'm sorry, but I have no trust whatsoever for the Chinese Communist Party. What they're going to do, and like Pompeo said, they view themselves as God, and they are going to offer 3 bishops, all of whom regard the Chinese Communist Party as God. And then Pope Francis, of course, can choose any one of them. But if you have 3 people who don't have any respect for the real church and the real, and that Jesus Christ needs to be the head of the church and not the Chinese Communist Party, he's not going to have any good choices to choose from.
Right.
It's a recipe for disaster.
What do you make of this notion that the persecution now is no different than it was in the past?
Struthius is the word, okay? He's got his head buried in the sand. Doesn't he read all the accounts of what's going on? Hasn't he seen all the Marian shrines that have stood for generations that are suddenly being torn down? I guess I don't know where he gets his information or if he's getting information. I just disagree with that.
Reggie Littlejohn, as always, thank you for your candor and for your work, and we will stay in touch with you. You can find Reggie Littlejohn's work for the Women's Rights Without Frontiers at womensrightswithoutfrontiers.org. Thanks again. Well, it's summer. I got the most amazing letter this week, complete with an illustration from a Will Wilder reader. You can keep your kids' reading skills sharp with Will Wilder 3, The Amulet of Power, and the entire Will Wilder series. They're available at bookstores everywhere, online, and through the EWTN catalog. That's all the time we have for now. Until next week, the show continues on Facebook and Twitter. Like me on Facebook, follow me on Twitter. I'll push all the news out to you as it happens. The links are at RaymondArroyo.com. Be sure to join us next week. Until then, we'll be scouting the world over for all that is seen and unseen. On behalf of the staff and crew of EWTN News, thank you for watching. I'm Raymond Arroyo from Washington, D.C. Bye now.